Hello everyone, I hope this essay finds you well. I've got something a bit special for you all today, and as an extra special treat, after asking you to like and subscribe, I thought I'd just get right into it. You know what you're here for. Jordan Peterson is a man who needs no introduction, presumably because wherever you're watching this from, you've probably had to engage with his fans or the news cycle surrounding him in order to get here. He's quite popular, although, of course, my personal favorite Peterson factoid is, and will always be, his abject lies about Bill C-16 in Canada, which he denounced for its supposed implication in compelling speech, when in fact the Act's summary on the Canadian Parliament's webpage reads as follows. Quote, "This enactment amends the Canadian Human Rights Act to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. The enactment also amends the Criminal Code to extend the protection against hate propaganda set out in that act to any section of the public that is distinguished by gender identity or expression, and to clearly set out that evidence that an offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on gender identity or expression constitutes an aggravating circumstance that a court must take into consideration when it imposes a sentence." End quote. In short, there was never any danger to anyone unless you think there's some reason that a criminal court could find with evidence that you did, with some kind of prejudice, commit some kind of aggravated discrimination against another person on the basis of either gender identity or gender expression. Naturally, years down the line, I think with Peterson's public comments in full view, it's not entirely unreasonable to wonder if this was in fact the very reason he was so opposed to Bill C-16 in the first place, especially considering some of his public remarks about transgender people, including those directed towards individuals like Elliot Page. As a transgender leftist myself, I often found over the years that Peterson's rhetoric emboldened a certain level of nastiness from people who watched his videos, attended his talks, chatted in his live streams, and read his books. I did not have an overly positive impression of the gentleman, is what I'm saying. This is necessary to bring up because I want you to understand what I mean when I say that I was actually surprised at the rhetoric in one of his recent podcast episodes over on the Daily Wire. I mentioned I was left-wing earlier, specifically a spooky, scary socialist and kooky, crazy communist, if the injection of Marx into some of my videos hadn't tipped you off. And so I was quite familiar with Peterson's history of objections to these ideologies in the past, which he tended to base on rhetorically contrasting individualism with collectivism. A lot of that rhetoric feels quaint now, but even at the time, I felt those terms didn't really capture the full extent of our political and philosophical disagreements. I talk about this in a video now available for patrons, but suffice it to say that in one sense of the word, I might be a collectivist where Peterson is an individualist, but then again, in another sense, I might be the individualist where he might be the collectivist. I really think these terms are nonsense at the end of the day, because understanding who we are as individuals makes it clear that our sense of self is predicated on the society around us, but also that this same self is psychologically a bit like a unique fingerprint or a special snowflake. We define ourselves and even develop in relation to each other, but we're all so different in many ways. Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst whose work Peterson is supposedly an expert on, actually brings this up in a very enlightened way in his book, The Undiscovered Self, The Dilemma of the Individual in Modern Society, when he says, quote, "The fact that the individual feels himself or the members of his family or the esteemed friends in his circle to be important merely underlines the slightly comic subjectivity of his feeling. For what are the few compared with 10,000 or 100,000, let alone a million? This recalls the argument of a thoughtful friend with whom I once got caught up in a huge crowd of people. Suddenly he exclaimed, quote, 'Here you have the most convincing reason for not believing in immortality. All those people want to be immortal.' The bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which after all is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery, and without knowing or wanting it has become its proselyte. The man who looks only outside and quails before the big battalions has no resource with which to combat the evidence of his sense and reason." End quote. I was reading this book for another different video that I'm hoping to release in a couple of months, and I just couldn't help myself when I saw the opportunity to use this quote here. If you couldn't tell, I think about it a lot. I don't agree with everything in it. For example, in that book, Jung is frequently disturbed by communism because he encounters it through the Red Scare as Stalinism. But of course, in describing state tyranny in those terms, he leaves on the table the actual McCarthyism of America, and obviously now, posthumously, the MAGA movement championed in part by one of his most infamous acolytes. Time, as they say, makes fools of us all. But I didn't bring up this Jung quote just to describe how I think lots of people mischaracterize real problems using the bad terminology of individualism or collectivism, or to tease a future video about Star Wars. No, I brought it up because it ties directly into what Jordan Peterson said in his recent talk with terminal blank slate Dave Rubin.
You know, when all this started, and I think it was the same with you, I regarded myself as a classic British liberal, essentially. Yeah. But I've come to understand something over the last 8 years that I didn't understand in the beginning, as certainly not as well anyways, is that liberal individualism only works when the collective is so well established that you can take it for granted.
Yes.
So as long as the self-evident truths remain self-evident, then you can have something like a liberal individualism.
So it's basically, as long as the conservatives are holding the door from the barbarians, then the liberals can be liberal.
Exactly that.
And that's how a functional society should work, in essence.
I have a few thoughts here, as you might have guessed. One which I'll throw out there is that you can always rely on Dave Rubin to get a little racist and xenophobic with it. Who are these barbarians knocking at our doors supposed to be? In my experience, it's not immigrants that threaten my way of life, but my own conservative countrymen. They're the ones who are most ardently attempting to prevent marginalized groups from gaining more rights, in addition to stripping away the ones they do have. You'd think Latinos were hopping the border and immediately bombing abortion clinics and killing the doctors who worked there the way that Dave Rubin talks about it. But no, that's American conservatives who've been doing that, and largely the white Christian ones as well. It's also odd because a lot of immigration to the United States of America, with which American conservatives take issue, which, as far as I'm aware, is by and large one of the most Catholic places on earth outside the Vatican. As an American who was raised Catholic, and especially in the context of how people like Peterson and Rubin talk about Western civilization and religion, are they intentionally saying that the values of Catholics are incompatible with the views on which this nation was founded? Probably not, I'm guessing. No, this is just about hating brown people. Another thing I'd like to hit on is that Peterson is supposed to be an expert in Jungian psychology, so it's a bit astounding for him to be caught with his pants down so far you'd think he was trying to bury them. He acts like he just discovered the necessity of collectivism, but I seem to recall him talking very frequently about the need for unifying mythology and belief, which is something you'd expect from a Jungian, I think, so really, I could say he sounds like he's a Jungian who has never read Jung, but on the whole, given my experience with him, I have a different thesis. He's a very narcissistic man who constantly feels the need to stress how important his own insight and advice is. There you go. He's affecting the posture of someone who has just recently made a very important discovery, when in reality, this is basically something he's always believed and he's just spinning it with rhetoric. This is part of why I've always resisted this idea that Jordan Peterson is someone very important to his fans because he gives them something they can't get anywhere else. Obviously that's not true, but it's only obvious if your first point of contact for this stuff isn't YouTube. If Peterson is the first guy you're hearing this from, maybe it sounds genius, but really he was always repackaging rhetoric and observations from other thinkers as his own enlightened material. Considering how his critiques of postmodernism as a movement tend to be poorly repackaged talking points ripped from Stephen Hicks's own poorly researched material on the subject, especially his Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism, and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault. Consider also his fixation on cultural Marxism, as an extension of the old far-right Nazi conspiracy theory of cultural Bolshevism, a parallel observed by many over the years. However, what most leave out is that this far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy that originally targeted the Frankfurt School to fearmonger about the political left was actually prominently imported to America in advance by more bog-standard political commentators, like Ralph de Toledano infamously did in his book, Cry Havoc, The Great American Bringdown and How It Happened. So critically, even Peterson's hokey right-wing propaganda is unoriginal. Now he's at the stage where he's repeating stuff he's said before, and that it would almost have been impossible for him not to have known, but in different words, with the weight of a kind of epiphany. This is all to contextualize why we're really here, of course. I want to talk about Tolkien, and specifically I want to talk about The Lord of the Rings. With that prior exchange between Reuben and Peterson fresh in our minds, we can listen to how Peterson invokes Tolkien to talk about the necessity of conservatism against the barbarian hordes at the gate.
Well, in the story of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, so the Shire is full of, well, let's call them liberals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're
smoking some stuff.
Yeah, they're hobbits, and they're all pursuing their own thing, and they think their little kingdom is everything. But, the borders are protected by the Striders. Aragorn is one of them, and it turns out that he's the descendant of ancient kings. And that's exactly right. It's like, as long as the perimeters are defended by the descendants of ancient kings, then there can be freedom inside the walls. And so, I've been criticized, the more public books I've written have been criticized for, what would you say, making a case out of the self-evident. But we are at a point where the self-evident is no longer self-evident and needs to be explained and defended. And that's actually, what would you say, that's what's turned me into a conservative to the degree that I am a conservative. It's like, well, all these things that are self-evident have to be restated and also explained.
Now, I could have made a whole thing out of just lore-checking Peterson here and making fun of him. Aragorn is not one of the Striders. He is called Strider as a pseudonym, and he is one of the Dunedain, and if I didn't say it, someone in my comments would. There you go, you little so-and-so. The Dunedain do patrol the northern kingdoms, including the vicinity around the Shire, but a more technically accurate analogy for what Peterson is talking about is Gondor. In Minas Tirith, as Boromir describes at the Council of Elrond, we can see some parallels. Quote, "At once Boromir stood up, tall and proud before them. 'Give me leave, Master Elrond,' said he, 'first to say more of Gondor, for verily from the land of Gondor I am come, and it would be well for all to know what passes there. For few, I deem, know of our deeds, and therefore guess little of their peril if we should fail at last. Believe not that in the land of Gondor the blood of Númenor is spent, nor all its pride and dignity forgotten. By our valor, the wild folk of the east are still restrained, and the terror of Morgul kept at bay, and thus alone are peace and freedom maintained in the lands behind us, bulwark of the west. But if the passages of the river should be won, what then?" End quote. That's just a part of what the character of Boromir, the eldest son of Denethor the Steward of Gondor, says at the Council of Elrond. That chapter is that character's introduction, but he's perhaps better known for his exit in the story. We'll return to him momentarily. To go one step further, however, the idea that the hobbits are airy-fairy rights-for-all liberals doesn't survive contact with the text because they're clearly a series of gossipy small-town social conservatives who are themselves judgmental and distrustful of the outside world. Much of the North is like this, as Aragorn himself describes at the Council of Elrond. Quote, "If Gondor Boromir has been a stalwart tower, we have played another part. Many evil things there are that your strong walls and bright swords do not stay. You know little of the lands beyond your bounds. Peace and freedom, you say? The North would have known them little but for us. Fear would have destroyed them. But when dark things come from the houseless hills, or creep from sunless woods, they fly from us. What roads would any dare to tread, if the Dunedain were asleep or were all gone into the grave? And yet less thanks have we than you. Travelers scowl at us, and countrymen give us scornful names. Strider I am, to one fat man who lives within a day's march of foes that would freeze his heart, or lay his little town in ruin, if he were not guarded ceaselessly. Yet we would not have it otherwise. If simple folk are free from care and fear, simple they will be, and we must be secret to keep them so. That has been the task of my kindred, while the years have lengthened and the grass has grown." End quote. One thing that I think you can probably grasp, even if you've never read the books, is that Aragorn has a very different thesis for how the world works than Boromir does. To Boromir, the strong walls of Minas Tirith are needed for the war with Mordor, and part of his narrative about the valor of his own struggle is that everything behind them is kept safe by the sacrifices his people make. You can see, maybe, the ghost of an argument that Peterson might make here. But Aragorn disagrees. To him, the idea that the walls of Minas Tirith defend the Shire, Bree, Rivendell, and anywhere else is obviously not the whole story, because his life is picking up the pieces behind the scenes. Aragorn's struggle is against the enemies within the kingdom supposedly kept safe by Gondor, and this is one of the few reasons why he's such a good candidate to be king, beyond his other personal qualities and his bloodline, of course. He's fought his whole life with no chance of valor to keep the little people of the world safe, and his pride comes not from the stories people tell about him, but from the good deeds he does. The self-valorizing narrative that Peterson spins is pretty antithetical to Aragorn's character, you see. He has a lot more in common with Boromir in other ways, too. Consider how Boromir's part in the narrative ends. Quote, "Ah, the ring," said Boromir, his eyes lighting. "The ring. Is it not a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt for so small a thing? So small a thing. And I have seen it only for an instant in the House of Elrond. Could I not have a sight of it again?" Frodo looked up. His heart went suddenly cold. He caught the strange gleam in Boromir's eyes, yet his face was still kind and friendly. "It is best that it should lie hidden," he answered. "As you wish. I care not," said Boromir. "Yet may I not even speak of it? For you seem ever to think only of its power in the hands of the enemy, of its evil uses, not of its good. The world is changing, you say. Minas Tirith will fall if the ring lasts. But why? Certainly if the ring were with the enemy, but why if it were with us?" "Were you not at the council?" answered Frodo. "Because we cannot use it, and what is done with it turns to evil." Boromir got up and walked about impatiently. "So you go on," he cried. "Gandalf, Elrond, all these folk have taught you to say so. For themselves they may be right. These elves and half-elves and wizards, they would come to grief perhaps. Yet often I doubt if they are wise and not merely timid. But to each his own kind. True-hearted men, they will not be corrupted. We of Minas Tirith have been staunch through long years of trial. We do not desire the power of wizard lords, only strength to defend ourselves, strength in a just cause. And behold, in our need chance brings to light the Ring of Power. It is a gift, I say, a gift to the foes of Mordor. It is mad not to use it, to use the power of the enemy against him. The fearless, the ruthless, these alone will achieve victory. What could not a warrior do in this hour? A great leader. What could not Aragorn do? Or if he refuses, why not Boromir? The ring would give me power of command, how I would drive the hosts of Mordor, and all men would flock to my banner." End quote. There's a lot I'd like to say about this passage. In the first place, I think Tolkien's command of the English language is on full display in his ability to convey the rhetoric Boromir uses to first conceal his intent and subsequently to make his various appeals to Frodo. You can see a lot of parallels to contemporary conservative rhetoric in his little speech. After feigning disinterest, one of the first things Boromir does is protest that he should be allowed to express his views, which is right in line with a lot of the supposed free speech appeals made by the political right, rhetorically. Perhaps Boromir would be against compelled speech as well, who knows. Then he jumps to accusing Frodo of being an NPC repeating Democrat MSNBC propaganda, or, in this case, the wisdom of the Council of Elrond. Next, he establishes the exceptional character of his people relative to other groups, a quality fundamental to conservatism. Finally, he beats his chest about the martial prowess of his kingdom, and paints a pretty picture about how glorious their victory would be. When you break it down, there's quite a lot of modern parallels here. I said something just now about exceptionality being a fundamental quality of conservatism. I know we didn't have time earlier to explore everything Peterson has ever said that I've taken issue with, or all the reasons why, and I'm sorry for that. But at least in this case, I'd like to offer up a citation for further reading. In Corey Robin's book, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism, From Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, he articulates the character of the left-right dispute and the central qualities of conservatism exceptionally well. And there's one quote in particular that stuck with me, which runs as follows. Quote, "Conservatism is the theoretical voice of the animus against the agency of the subordinate classes. It provides the most consistent and profound argument as to why the lower orders should not be allowed to exercise their independent will, why they should not be allowed to govern themselves or the polity. Submission is their first duty, and agency the prerogative of the elite. Though it is often claimed that the left stands for equality while the right stands for freedom, this notion misstates the actual disagreement between the right and left. Historically, the conservative has favored liberty for the higher orders and constraint for the lower orders. What the conservative sees and dislikes in equality, in other words, is not a threat to freedom, but its extension. For in that extension, he sees a loss of his own freedom. We are all agreed as to our own liberty, declared Samuel Johnson, but we are not agreed as to the liberty of others. For in proportion as we take, others must lose. I believe we hardly wish that the mob should have liberty to govern us. Such was the threat that Edmund Burke saw in the French Revolution, not merely an expropriation of property or explosion of violence, but an inversion of the obligations of deference and command. The levelers, he claimed, only change and pervert the natural order of things. End quote. What this necessarily entails is a delineation made by the conservative movement between those who are categorically deserving of power and station and those who categorically are not. This demand is both moral, as Rubin notes, and aesthetic. There is a natural order of things, and the role of the conservative movement is to maintain and restore this, or so conservative philosophy tends to maintain. We can ascertain from this that there's truly no contradiction in Peterson's philosophy. It might seem odd that someone could champion some notion of freedom and then constrain it by his own prerogative, but this is itself the nature of conservatism. It's not the men standing on the wall thinking of themselves as sons of kings fighting against barbarian hordes who will have their freedoms constrained in this proposal. Instead, it is the others, the lessers both within and without, and in Peterson's unfortunate analogy that includes not only the hobbits but also Aragorn, because if Boromir were to use a power to subdue the lands within the traditional bounds of Gondor and the North in a manner that infringed on the liberties of the people who lived there, that would be the kind of thing Aragorn would fight against. And in fact, Tolkien paints that kind of corruption as a necessary consequence of even an otherwise good man trying to use the ring, which has been observed many times over as an easily ascertainable thesis in The Lord of the Rings about power and its way of perverting good intentions. But in Peterson's view, using the ring, using power to oppress, but with the ultimate aim of affirming other values down the road, is somehow desirable or useful. Peterson has failed in using Tolkien to prove his point, and has in fact demonstrated that he lives in a world where Frodo should have given Boromir the ring, where Aragorn would not have been king of Gondor, and over here in reality where he places no broad value on the liberty of human beings generally, but rather belongs to an ideological tradition which victimizes those without and those within. It is the conservatives within America who are the greatest threat to Americans in their day-to-day lives, and they have more in common with the right-wing movements from other nations that they use to vilify immigrants and foreigners generally than they do with any other group, because they have a thesis about power and authority which legitimizes oppression for a tactical purpose. There is no horror Carl Jung could have seen in communism, socialism, authoritarianism, state ideologies, or anything else which cannot be found in the worldview of Jordan Peterson, and if that doesn't show the need for the truly vigilant among us to watch out for this despicable authoritarian movement on American soil, waving the American flag and carrying the Holy Bible, then I don't know what will.